Hello, I'm Christian, and you're listening to Inside the Cambodia Project, an educational podcast where we discuss cutting-edge research on sustainable business in an emerging market.
Last episode, producer Ben Beck talked with Sam Christensen, a fellow professional in the podcast industry who actually served a mission in Cambodia. If you missed that episode, Ben and Sam discuss some of the cultural differences inherent to Southeast Asia, as well as various hypotheses about their effect on the small businesses. Sam actually has his own podcast called The Best Two, and it's really quite good. I'd encourage anyone who's curious to give it a listen. But now, on to today's podcast. I met David Benaim in an unusual way. I was working on a project in Excel this summer, and when I hit an obstacle, I did what I always do and consulted YouTube. The first video I clicked on featured a brilliant solution to my problem, but it also featured a sample data set from Cambodia. I saw names like Phnom Penh, Kampot, and Siem Reap and thought, I would know those places anywhere. I reached out to the author of the video to ask where he got his data, and that's how I met David. David is an Excel MVP and data analyst who's been working and living in Cambodia for the past 11 years. And I'm so thankful to David for joining me today via Zoom. It's so great to have you on the podcast, David. I'm excited to talk with you about something that you're passionate about. And from what you've told me, it sounds like you were pretty involved in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So normally I like to kick off each episode with a quote. However, today we're going to do things a little bit differently. I think what I'd like to do is split the episode into 3 parts. So part 1 is going to be, I'd really like to hear a little more about your background and maybe on your journey of becoming a Cambodian expat. 11 years is a long time. Then we'll move into part 2 and talk about the meat and potatoes of today's discussion, which is COVID in Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
And then part 3, if we have time, I'd really be interested to hear your thoughts on maybe some of the major lessons we can learn from your experiences, particularly in the aftermath of the global pandemic. How's that sound?
Sounds great to me, yeah. Ready to go.
Okay, awesome, perfect. So David, before we get into today's topic, I would love it if you could tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you come to live in Cambodia? And maybe also, why did you stay in Cambodia?
Yeah, so I was stuck in kind of the corporate machine. I was working in London in a big accounting firm, Deloitte, for 5 years. And it was 2013 at the time. And I really kind of wanted a change, but I didn't really know what to go into next. And I did plan to stay in London, but I wanted to take a sabbatical and go traveling. That seemed a little bit irresponsible in the era of the global financial crisis. So instead, I looked to do like a kind of volunteering opportunity abroad, because my thinking was I could still have a bit of an adventure, still do a bunch of traveling when I go somewhere exciting, but then also be developing skills in kind of a new area in the field of accounting, which is what I was doing at the time. So I came across this organization called Accounting for International Development. It's kind of like Doctors Without Borders, but instead of saving lives, we save balance sheets.
Okay, very noble of you.
Yeah, thank you. So originally I had planned to go to Latin America. I grew up in Gibraltar, so I wanted to kind of practice my Spanish, and I'd really liked my previous traveling expedition to South America. So I contacted them and they said, well, we don't have anything in South America at the moment. We can offer you something in India or something in Cambodia. And at the time, knowing not very much about either two countries, Cambodia to me sounded better. I had been traveling to Thailand and Laos before, so I was familiar with the region. And so I ended up taking a role that they offered me in Cambodia.
Was this a paid role or unpaid?
No, so it was unpaid. So it was like this organization, Accounting for International Development, were the middle people who had set up accountants with NGOs who wanted to get help in some area of accounting. And the one that I was doing was helping a non-profit with their annual budget plan. And what these guys did was they were called Cambodian Living Arts, so they helped preserve the traditional performance art space. So Cambodia is very rich in terms of music and dance and theater, but unfortunately with the Khmer Rouge, that they did target and kill a lot of the artists. So this organization was aiming to kind of find some artists that were still around when they started off, and then make sure that the skills are taught and transferred to the future generations, and therefore preserved and not lost. So they had been running for over a decade when I went to them, so they were already pretty elaborate in the work they were doing and working with a lot of young artists in those kind of spaces. So I went over there and I worked with them for 2 months, and I did a bunch of little jobs as well as the annual budget. One of them was Excel training, which they said they wanted some help with. At the time, I considered myself kind of, intermediate in Excel, but not great. And they wanted training so I could help them with that, but also forced me to be able to understand more myself, because they would ask questions that I couldn't answer, and then I would learn it myself. And I had some free time because the volunteering placement wasn't too intense. So that's when I became obsessed with Excel. And as you said, you found me on YouTube, and I did launch a YouTube channel and became completely obsessed. And within a year of that, I was running kind of a business that is helping organizations with getting better through Excel and accounting processes, as well as teaching Excel. And, fast forward 11 years, now I have a YouTube channel with 16,000 subscribers about Excel and other business tech. I do lots of blogs about Excel. I do webinars all around the world and seminars all around the world in Excel. And I'm completely obsessed. And I'm considered a Microsoft MVP, which means Microsoft considers me to be in the top 100 or so Excel people worldwide, which is pretty cool.
That's a great, tagline to put on your LinkedIn profile, or, when you're pushing yourself out there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. No, it's good. And I enjoy the role and sort of hanging around with a lot of the other MVPs and stuff. So that's
sure.
good.
I feel like Excel is one of those skills that a lot of people get about ankle deep in Excel, but no deeper, right? Like myself, I definitely was running into some of those challenges this summer, and your videos definitely helped out. I have a question though, as you developed your own business and kind of became more of an entrepreneur and an Excel master, why did you stay in Cambodia of all places? Why didn't you go back to Gibraltar or somewhere else and take your business with you?
So I think that when I came to Cambodia, I just kind of fell in love with the country and the lifestyle, and it's a really great place to be. It's very easy for foreigners to come here and set up business. Like, there aren't many countries in the world, I believe, where a foreigner can just legally set up a fully incorporated company and be 100% shareholder and organize their visas through that. But Cambodia does allow a lot of flexibility with that, and they invite kind of foreign entrepreneurs and foreign workers to come over here. And that's also what makes it kind of a nice sort of lifestyle. There's a lot of entrepreneurship happening, and also lots of people coming in from all over the world to do lots of different things. And it makes it a really interesting place to do business, I find, because I end up being able to work with a lot of different types of clients, be it conservation NGOs, be it sort of private companies, be it government entities, UN, all sorts of different organizations that I don't feel I could get to that similar kind of exposure if I was in other places.
Wow, that's kind of a unique. I wasn't expecting that answer. So thanks for sharing that. I can't imagine. I mean, can you give me some examples? Who are the kinds of people that you're associating with on a daily basis in Cambodia? I mean, how many of your friends or fellow entrepreneurs are actually from Cambodia, and how many are from other countries?
Yeah, so it is a mix. There's lots of entrepreneurs who are like kind of setting up different sort of uh, restaurants, cafes. There's some people who are setting up like clotheslines and getting some clothes manufactured here, sustainably. There's someone who I'm friends with who she's American and she works with a bunch of Cambodians, and what they do is they create like uh, clotheslines out of recycled fast fashion to kind of avoid disposals and stuff like that. There's my friend Matt who he works in marine conservation, and he goes scuba diving and makes sure that the populations of turtles and seahorses and other fish are kept sustainable and things like that. Yeah, there's friends I have in Cambodian Living Arts again, and all sorts of things. But then also like your standard kind of private investment firms and real estate development companies and all sorts of other things.
Wow. It sounds like you are well connected, and that is so cool. I wish I had a friend who went scuba diving for his job. That's got to be really fun. Has he ever taken you with him?
Yeah. We go on tours sometimes. Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, well, I'd like to just change gears slightly here and talk about March of 2020. So
Yeah.
that for most of us, March of 2020 rings some alarm bells go off in our heads, I think, because that, of course, is when the global pandemic, known colloquially as COVID, swept across the world.
Yes.
Now, COVID was really a unique phenomenon because it affected nearly everyone. And yet, depending on where you were living when it hit, you could have had a very different experience. For
Mhm.
example, when COVID hit, I was in Spain.
Mm.
My family was in the United States, and our experiences with both the onset of COVID and then, the aftermath were so completely different. It was
Mm.
kind of jarring, but interesting. So I want to dig a little bit into that. Where were you, David, when COVID first hit Cambodia? What were you doing, and how did you find out, what was happening?
Yeah, well, being obviously closer to China than you would have been, so we were pretty aware of the situation, I think, and the severity of the situation could become a bit earlier than the rest of the world. I remember I got really annoyed because I had secured this like pretty big work contract to go to Vietnam and Singapore and do a bunch of training, and that had been in the talks for 6 months, and it was scheduled in February 2020, and then Vietnam was actually the first country to close schools and universities, so they pulled the plug on the whole contract, and I was really annoyed because I was looking forward to it. Obviously, it was quite lucrative financially, so that's what first alerted me to be like, oh wow, this is really going to be a thing. In March 2020, when everything was being hit, it was mid-March, around the 14th. Then there were lots of the embassies here who were saying, we're going to organize special flights back to different countries, and we advise you to please get on these flights because it might be difficult in future to get on similar flights. So I remember sitting around a pool on a Sunday afternoon. This is a common event that I do with my friends here, and we were sitting in the pool and we were like, should we go? And we all decided that we were going to stay. We didn't know what to expect. We knew that it could be bad, and we knew that definitely Cambodia was not known for having very strong healthcare facilities if things were going to go badly. But we also knew that we had built lives here and that we had jobs here, And if we do go back, then it might end up being a long, long time till we can return to Cambodia. So we all decided to stay in March 2020, and those kind of alerts from the embassies kept going for a couple of months. But as it transpired, by April, but definitely by May time, during the month of April, most of us kind of stayed home. There were no restrictions here because COVID was spreading, but the numbers were very, very small. And the borders were shut down in Cambodia, so you could only get back into the country if you did a 2-week quarantine. And
Sure.
there were no tourist visas. So they were trying to contain what was already spreading in the country. And by the time of middle of May, a lot of us were kind of messaging each other and occasionally meeting up outdoors, but not very regularly. And we were realizing that Cambodia had not had a case that spread in about 5 weeks, not a single case. That was recorded anyway. And we were all like, maybe things are okay over here. And it wasn't just Cambodia, it was also Thailand and Vietnam, and all of our neighboring countries just weren't having the COVID spread that other places were. And there were no restrictions. And at some point we were like, do you guys want to go meet up for a beer? So we did that.
Why not?
Yeah, it looked like it was safe. There were definitely no legal things that were stopping us from doing it. So we ended up doing that. And then for the rest of 2020, things were very much back to normal here. I remember being in like very large events. I organized some large events, both professionally and personally. And we would get 100 plus people to events, and we were tracking the numbers, and Cambodia was tracking the numbers they were testing people as they were flying in, and there were some cases day to day of people flying in, but they were quarantined and it wasn't spreading. And that kind of continued. There were a couple of instances in November 2020 where there was a little bit of spread, but it seemed to be contained. I was very closely monitoring it, as were a bunch of other people, and that was contained. And it continued that way kind of until February 2021. Well, how was it for you in 2020?
Oh man, it was such a different experience than what you just described. I wish I could say that it was the same. But COVID really, when it hit Spain, it hit hard. I remember again mid-March, the notices went out, and everyone just was confined to their apartments, and there was a government mandate to stay indoors, stay at your residence, and the policy was you could leave once a week to go shopping, grocery shopping, and take care of the necessities for 1 hour, and you had to wear a mask and gloves. Yeah, I literally remember walking into a grocery store with a mask on and putting on these big yellow gloves and pushing a shopping cart around.
Mm-hmm.
It was so surreal. I remember feeling like I was living in a movie, one of those sci-fi dystopian horrors where everything's gone terribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Here I was, not even in my home country too, and just kind of aghast at what was happening around me. And that was the state of things probably until about July, when we were finally allowed outside with masks. Everything got a lot more open, and you started seeing people again. But for probably a good 2 or 3 months there, all of Spain was just a ghost town. I mean, you didn't see people in the streets. You barely saw people in the grocery store when you went. And every day, you would read the news and hear about more and more people dying from this COVID, this coronavirus. So that was my experience about until July. And then at that point, the cases started dropping for the first time, and everything got much more relaxed. But like I said, very different than what you experienced in Cambodia. And I think had things been different, had they been like they were in Cambodia, I probably wouldn't have been so jarred by the experience of COVID. And I might have been, going out for drinks with my friends,
Uh-huh.
just like you were. But would you say that your reaction was a pretty general reaction? Like, were there other Cambodian citizens also going out, hanging out with their friends? Was there a scare? Was everyone just hiding and you were the brave ones, or
Uh,
was everyone kind of getting out and about?
in 2020, everyone was getting out and about for sure. Like, it was something that we were aware of and monitoring, but there hadn't been any reported cases, and like it was very clear that it wasn't spreading. It wasn't like it wasn't like I had friends that would get sick. It was like, like I was cautious at the time. It was before the rapid tests came in. Tests were a little bit more difficult and take a few days to turn around and stuff. So, you know,
Uh-huh.
I think I got a cold 2 times in that year, and when I got a cold, I was like, I'm staying home. I'm not seeing anyone. I'm being very secure just in case it might be COVID. But yeah, and my friends would do the same. And uh, but mostly like in this whole region, things were pretty normal. Uh, People wear face masks in Southeast Asia a lot more than other countries anyway, or in Asia in general. So there
Fair
was
enough.
a lot of that. But yeah, that all kind of changed in February 2021. So February 2021 was when the quarantine system kind of broke. Like there was an incident where a group of a couple of people paid off some security guards who let them out of the hotel, and then they went out to party basically, and they had COVID. So, but at this point, the alpha variant, which was more contagious than the original variant, was spreading around the world, and these people had the alpha variant, which meant that it was spreading a little bit more. And a theory that is not proven, but a lot of people think this theory is that the original COVID strain wasn't spreading in Southeast Asia. Could be for a bunch of reasons, probably a combination. It's a very outdoor lifestyle. People don't spend as much time indoors. People are wearing face masks, as I said. People wash their hands. It's less touching going on between people and stuff like that. It could be for a
Sure.
variety of reasons. Some people say the diet, yeah. But the original variant just wasn't spreading. But once the alpha variant came in, that ended up spreading. And so what started off with these two people, I remember this very vividly because I had planned for 6 months to organize a huge event on Sunday, the 21st of February. It was a tuk-tuk scavenger hunt that was going to be,
Oh,
yeah, 150 people signed up. It was going to be amazing. And then,
that sounds like a riot.
yeah, it was amazing. But then the night before, the day before, there were rumors going around of COVID spreading. And then later in the afternoon, it was confirmed that COVID had been spreading at that point for about a week and a half. So COVID had been spreading, and therefore there were no restrictions in place. But the responsible thing that we decided to do was to cancel the event. We ended up running it a year later, so it wasn't all lost. But yeah, it
Okay,
was
good.
it was really upsetting. And from that day on, COVID was spreading, and the numbers were, in the 30s, 30 cases per day roughly for the first couple of weeks. Then it went up. Then there was reporting about how it was first in Phnom Penh, the capital, then it spread out first to Sihanoukville, the beach area, where there had been some of the tourists going as well, and then the rest of the country over time. And yeah, yeah, so that's
So
how it went in.
when when all of that is happening, you've been living with this global phenomenon, COVID, for about a year now, and yet you've been so far removed in Cambodia, kind of
Yeah,
almost protected.
yeah.
Um, So until February 21st. So walk me through, what are you feeling, now that a year later, almost a year after the virus was announced, it's hitting, and it's hitting hard in Cambodia. What are your feelings?
Um, so my feelings are, um, we know that this has greatly affected the rest of the world, but we also, for some reason, have had this kind of immunity, and maybe with this immunity, it'll just continue and go back to normal. Or maybe we're going to be in the same state as other countries. We thought it would be likely to be the latter, but
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, what was going on the other hand, was that the vaccines were already in existence, and the first vaccines had been already rolled out. Very, very, very tiny minority. At that point, they had vaccinated kind of military and some health workers originally, but they did exist. So we knew that there was an exit on the horizon, which was not the same that the Western world and the rest of the world had a year prior, when we didn't know if vaccines would be feasible, if they would take 6 months or 6 years, whereas we already kind of had a little bit of hope in that regard. But what was happening was there was nationwide panic. And a lot of the media was doing a terrible job at making this panic go from bad to worse. The local newspapers would publish a headline that would be like, 80 cases found in Cambodia. The doom is upon it, kind of implying that sort of thing. But they would never make reference to the fact that 80 cases found today, but actually there were 95 cases yesterday and 110 cases the day before, so the trend was actually going down. They would never make reference to a trend. They would never make reference to the fact that it was in this area, and had an outbreak was contained in a certain area and had now moved to another area, maybe. Nothing like that. It'd be sort of that, there might be an incident, like there might be one wedding where there was a big outbreak, and that would make the global headline, but obviously that's not necessarily going to cause a stir in the entire nation from one wedding, but this would cause kind of a lot of panic. And so what I did was I started creating spreadsheets, as I love doing, and I would plug in the numbers of the number of cases today, the number of cases yesterday, the number of cases the day before, broken down by region, and I would create some very simple charts in Excel. And I found this useful for myself, so I posted it on social media and did it on Facebook and Twitter. And then and then people were commenting that they enjoyed it and found it useful. So I did it then again the next day and the next day and the next day. And I had been doing this for about 2 weeks to a month every day. And I had thousands of people that were reading my posts on a daily basis. And I would kind of walk around the street and people would identify me as the person who does the COVID posts, particularly in the expat community, but also in the local Cambodian community as well.
You're kidding.
Yeah. And people said they found it really useful. Like lots of people would say they would plan literally which province to travel to based on the COVID rates that I was publishing, or officers of reasonably large organizations were telling me they were deciding whether to reopen their offices for employees to come into work or not, work from home based on that information. So it was it had become something that I felt comfortable by taking the numbers and putting them somewhere else. And I ended up working with a lot of local media channels as well. The ones that wanted to be a little bit less doomsday approach were open to doing that. So I had one that I was publishing with every day. And in the early days as well, there was news that was published in Chinese and in Khmer, which is local Cambodian language, and in English. And they would happen at various points during the day. So me and someone that worked in the local media would kind of use Google Translate and get whatever we could from the different information and combine it together. And we would be messaging. At that point, I was messaging him, even though I've never met him. I was messaging him more than I was messaging anyone else in my work or in my personal life. And yeah, we were just kind of coming up with these things, and it was something that I was committing to. Obviously, it was a volunteer thing. I wasn't getting paid for any of it. But I was enjoying doing it, and I felt it was nice to be able to help out where I could. As that transpired, there was another woman who called Bailey, a Canadian woman, who got in touch with me, and she wanted to create like a mapping system whereby you could create like the maps of where the outbreaks are happening, where the deaths are happening. The first month there were no deaths, but then eventually that did start. And yeah, and so I worked with both of them quite a lot. But I was publishing on my social media, so I would get a lot of people who would see me as the go-to person for anything related to COVID. I mean, I was just doing the data.
Jeez.
I would always kind of write a disclaimer at the end of my post saying like I'm a data specialist, not a health specialist. So I'm commenting at this about the data side. But I would get people asking me like, I have these symptoms. What does that mean? Where do I go for a test? Where do I go for a vaccine? And
oh man,
I didn't.
That's got to be a lot of pressure on
Yeah.
you. How much time are you spending on this every day? And people they're coming to you as the COVID celebrity expert. What's going through your mind as you're getting these comments?
Yeah. So honestly, like at that point, I could tell that this was becoming such an area for concern. So I just wanted to do whatever I could to help. And that was where I was coming from. So if someone would come with a question that I could answer, I would respond. If someone would say something that's health related, I would say, sorry, I'm not at liberty to say. But, and also because I got all these questions, I ended up getting a lot more answers than everyone else as well. Like someone would be like, hey, where's my vaccine? Where can I get a vaccine? And then I would respond like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure where you can get one. And they would be like, oh, actually, don't worry, I found it. So I'd be like, hey, hang on a minute. If you know where to get a vaccine, tell me this information so I can answer the other 30 people who have messaged me today about so I would kind of crowdsource and then, share that information as well. And yeah, and I would help people as best I could. And I think people were grateful for it. There were some people were leaving comments on my posts and stuff. I was also running webinars at that point to kind of explain things. And I had become a bit more of an expert than anything else. I knew about things like incubation periods, and I knew about the different variants and what they meant and what the differences might be. I knew about epidemiology to a small degree that I felt comfortable talking about some things. And I did actually do a webinar alongside an epidemiologist where I was talking on the data side and they were talking about the science behind it. So I was kind of helping people. I did occasionally get some haters who were giving negative comments that I found kind of got me down, if I'm honest. Because I was putting in all this effort and trying to help, but there were some people who were like saying that I was, I didn't have the background to be doing what I was doing, which was kind of why I put in the disclaimer. But yeah, that was
Sure.
No,
that seems like a reasonable reaction, and you're gonna have some pushback. There's always the hecklers, no matter where you are, what industry you're in. But on the whole, it sounds like you were extremely prolific during this time period. How did you, in an earlier call, we talked about this, and I'm just wondering, how did you eventually get involved with Cambodia's government and their efforts to track and treat COVID?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at this point, it got to April 2021. So about 7 weeks after the outbreak had started. And Cambodia, for the first time, announced a lockdown. It ended up being a three-week lockdown, which is far shorter than pretty much any country that I can think of. But they announced a full lockdown. And when that happened, I got a call from someone who I had previously done some professional work with, who had been kind of recruited to do a bit of stuff with government, who said, I've been following your stuff and I've shown it to the people in government who I'm working with, and they would be interested in maybe hiring you to do some data work on some of the deeper data that's not kind of, it's a lot more granular than the public data that gets put in the local media. But would you be able to help with that? Would you be willing to help with that? And it is a paid project. So that was good because, I've been doing hours per day every day on doing this kind of free volunteer stuff, which I was happy to continue doing. But this was going to be something that I would get paid for, and
Sure.
so that was kind of offered to me, and then I ended up working with the government. It was like a special subcommittee they created on the detection and prevention of COVID-19 in Cambodia. And I worked on analyzing data to a larger degree on building a Power BI kind of dashboard that might be able to identify the micro area where there has been a rise in case numbers, or outbreaks that are coming to an end, and essentially help identify the high risk areas that end up being targeted for additional measures to be put in place, or for vaccinations to be fast forwarded to that specific region. That was being that. I also helped design the spreadsheet where people were literally writing out COVID case number 1 today, number 2 today, number 3 today, number 4 today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I was working with the epidemiologist who were kind of testing for the different variants and identifying how that was happening. So this became kind of a work that I really felt passionate about. I enjoyed doing it. I remember we had to have some online meetings at 1 a.m. because that was the time where they'd finished the COVID data for the day, and how to change the spreadsheets, or how to change the automated analysis, and writing reports, and doing comparisons to other countries. That was a big part of what I was doing, how other countries were doing outbreaks, were doing vaccinations.
So I kind of want to jump on that last comment. How would you say Cambodia did on the whole? Now looking back, it's been about 2 or 3 years, but you were monitoring COVID in Cambodia versus COVID in all these other countries. How did Cambodia do as far as COVID went, and as far as the government and then the citizen reaction to COVID? How did they fare?
So this will likely never be talked about or reported ever by any media outlet, but I really believe that Cambodia handled the COVID crisis better than any country in the entire world, which is pretty crazy to think because it's a small country, it's developing world, and the health facilities are not known to be the best. But after I finished the work with government in 2020, late 21 and most of 22, I was hired by UNICEF to actually do an analysis on how COVID went for Cambodia and comparison to other countries. So
Cool.
That was a very big project that I worked on for a year with a team of experts in the health fields, in report writing and other fields as well. And I mean, there are 3 factors that I looked at to come to this conclusion. So one of them is countries which had fewer than 100 deaths in 2020. There were a handful of them. Cambodia was one of them. Cambodia, in fact, had 0 deaths until about March 2021. So it wasn't
Wow.
just less than 100, but it was actually zero. And then the second factor was countries that had over 70% of their population fully vaccinated in 2021. And this was almost exclusively kind of OECD countries. Countries that were wealthier were able to do that. Cambodia had 81% vaccinated in that year.
That is a crazy statistic. Wow.
And then the third one is countries that had smaller lockdowns. So I looked at countries that had a total lockdown of less than 50 days. And there were, again, a bunch of countries that did. Sweden, quite famously, went the no lockdown strategy, but Sweden did not have less than 100 deaths in 2020, nowhere near. So Cambodia had 21 days in lockdown. Well, my city, Phnom Penh, did. There was another city, Siem Reap, that had a similar number, which was in a different time period. But yeah, 21 days in lockdown. So in this Venn diagram that I built, that's kind of the main thing in my report, like the headline graphic. Cambodia is the only one that's in the center of these three circles. And not only is it in the center, but it's in the center in each of the three categories by a very significant margin. 21 days as opposed to 50 days or under. 0 deaths as opposed to 100 or under. And the 100 or under deaths, these were associated with countries in Australasia. So as I said, Thailand and Singapore and places like that kept COVID to a minimum, as did Australia and New Zealand. But they did not have, they ended up locking down for a lot longer than Cambodia in 2021. Yeah. And then the second one is 81% vaccinated that Cambodia has, and 50 days in lockdown. The 50 days in lockdown I mentioned. And looking back into some of the things that I think that made that had Cambodia just really set out from above. So they did contain it, as I said earlier, by forcing 2-week quarantine before you get into the country. Then also the vaccinations that they rolled out. And I remember the peak of my working with the government period, and I was working with some epidemiologists as well. Delta variant, which was much more contagious than anything the world had seen before, was spreading and started out in India, was coming to other countries. And we knew that it was going to come to Cambodia. We were testing it day by day at the variant testing centers, and it was contained at the border for a couple of months. So again, this is where the media was going crazy. It was saying 3 cases of Delta variant found, but they have been contained. These people are not, they're actually in quarantine.
But they leave that part out.
Yeah, they leave that part out. Yeah, I know. And I was monitoring it, and I was the one that was mentioning this in a very in the written part of my daily posts to kind of circumvent this kind of paranoia that was being built. But when it eventually did come in, this was a pretty dark time when Cambodia realized that they had to really, really accelerate things. So it was July 2021 and late July, I believe it was late July. And then what they did was they put in, immediately overnight, they put in nationwide measures. They didn't go into lockdown, but they put in additional measures of traveling from province to province and a few other things, gathering of events. So overnight, they did that as a nationwide thing. And also what they did, and this is so impressive, they accelerated their vaccinations. And we're talking about a developing world country who is in the heart of their rainy season, dishing out vaccines to the most rural of areas that have no functional roads for months of the year during this time period. And they were able to get the vaccinations to these places.
How did they do it?
So they had like loads of mobile carts that they would spread out. They trained the military officials. I did mention briefly the military were amongst the first to be vaccinated, and military were actually rolling out the vaccines. and helping facilitate the whole process. And they served a very critical role in that happening, as well as obviously the health specialists, but there weren't enough of those to do it to the extent that they did. And I kid you not,
Wow.
Cambodia, for about a 1 or 2 week period, became the fastest vaccinating country in the entire world during these couple of weeks where Delta variant was found, because they immediately made, Cambodia, the fastest vaccinating country in the world. I was reporting on it. I was checking the stats every day on global country by country, and they knew that this was something they had to do very, very quickly to avoid a horrible outbreak that would lead to many, many deaths. But they did it. And at that point, the big cities like Phnom Penh and Sihanoukville and Siem Reap had been vaccinated already. The easy job was done. It's very easy to vaccinate people in an urban place where people have higher levels of education. They know that they should do it. They listen to the news, versus and they live in the urban places. There are roads, versus doing it to like farmers in the most rural of places. And Cambodia is one of the least urbanized countries in the entire world as well. Only 24% of people live in urbanized areas here. So during the heart of rainy season, which in Cambodia runs between May and October every year, they managed to get this done. And then they vaccinated children. After they got through the adults, they vaccinated the children. There was very, very little people hesitating to vaccinate. They were very much like a health authorities say this is what we should do, so we're going to take our vaccines. So yeah, those kind of things helped as well. And then after that happened, the rest of Southeast Asian countries were not as fast to vaccinate for sure. So there was some hesitation about which vaccines to take. There was some hesitations about whether or not they should even take the vaccine, whereas Cambodia managed to get the vaccines and make sure that people took the best vaccine available to them at the time. And then Cambodia was able to reopen fully earlier than other countries in the region as well. So by November, they had fully reopened. They had reissued visas. There was no quarantine period if you had proof of vaccination. And yeah, and by then things were back to normal, and we all moved on with our lives.
Those are some really crazy, really significant findings that you just shared. And this whole time I've got this burgeoning question. I guess it's a pair of questions, but it really comes down to why. So if you don't mind me asking, I have two whys for you. The number one is why. You mentioned that this will probably never be published or see the light of day as far as media is concerned. Why do you think COVID in Cambodia, which it sounds like it was a veritable miracle of sorts, why has it not received, worldwide attention as kind of this best practice to be followed for future pandemics? And my follow-up question to that is, why do you think Cambodia, of all places, was the most successful in terms of its response to the global pandemic? And I'm not talking about, I would love if you could go a little bit deeper than just, how did they react, but why Cambodia? What was it about their culture, their traditions, the kind of people living in Cambodia that really enabled that country to, prepare them to respond effectively? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, let me do this second question. So I don't think we will ever know the full extent as to why COVID did not spread in Southeast Asian countries like it spread in several other countries. Some combination of the climate, people spending more time outside, possibly the diet, possibly the lifestyle, possibly wearing more face masks on a day-to-day basis. I don't think we'll ever know the full extent of that. What we can say, though, is that the people were very susceptible to thinking that the health authorities knew best. So if the health authorities say you need to wear a mask from now on, they would do that. If the health authorities would say we're in lockdown now, you need to do that. If the health authorities say you need to take this vaccine, they would do that. It was far from perfect, for sure. I mean, one of the dark parts was there were these areas in the city that the government deemed to be red zones that were under super, super strict lockdown. So people were not even allowed to leave their homes, leave their apartments. They would get food deliveries that were government controlled, but those food deliveries were scarce and sometimes not enough. And so there were about a 2-week period where this was happening, and in a small area of the city within the larger country, that was not ideal. But people kind of understood that some things were needed, maybe not to this extreme extent, but some things were needed to contain that. And what they did well in that time was that they said, all right, well, we're going to make sure that you get vaccinated when you're in these red zones right now, just to ensure that this will not happen again. And so they did vaccinate at the same time as doing that. Yeah, there were other areas where there were some decisions that were not the best, but I think that every country in the world had some instances of that. And I think that Cambodia, on the big decisions, they did really well. And the people, were susceptible to understanding that and understanding the extent of the threat. But also they were open to, if the messaging is that you need to be cautious, but you can still have your events, socialize, then they were able to do that. Well, we were seeing in other countries where a lot of people protesting, they didn't want to wear masks, they didn't want to stay home, they didn't want to take the vaccine. The Cambodian people were a lot more open to listening to the experts on that. To answer your first question, why is it that this is not being reported? I think it's just because Cambodia is not an important country in the world context. It's not considered to be an important country in the world context. And so it's not really appealing to global newspapers to run articles like this. I do have some journalist friends who I was talking to at the time about doing something and writing something together. And we did something for regional publications. I wrote a few articles with them. But that was the kind of response I was getting. Like, pitching this kind of project, this kind of article probably won't be successful. So for better or worse, I think that's what was happening.
I think that makes sense. Although it is kind of disappointing, and I almost, I almost want to prove those journalists wrong and make the story, fly around the world, because I don't know, I feel like in this case, Cambodia kind of exceeded expectations. It kind of surprised everybody. And I'm surprised knowing what I know about Cambodia. I'm sure you know more than I do, but this is definitely out of the ordinary. It's not what I would have expected to hear, that Cambodia, of all countries, was the most successful at dealing with COVID.
Just a couple of follow-ups on that as well. Other reasons why it was never talked about was, number one, because we didn't really know enough about this to be able to sort of compare different countries' approaches until it was about 2022. And by that point, the world was done with COVID. People didn't want to read about it every day. People didn't want things. So, people would roll their eyes if they'd ever see another headline about, like, oh, we have to be cautious again, we have to do this again. So that was one factor. And one thing that I do take comfort in is the project that I did with UNICEF in 2022, that me and the team I was working with worked really hard to kind of document this. So the documentation does exist. And it's with UNICEF, which is obviously a gigantic global organization, part of the UN. And I take comfort in the fact that is there. And hopefully, if there is another pandemic, and I'm sure there will be one at some point, maybe they'll look at the report that we wrote and the analysis that we did.
Love it. Yeah, that kind of is my last question for you, David, and it's been really great hearing your insights today. I just wanted to ask, as we look at Cambodia as this stalwart example for how to react to a global threat, a global pandemic, or whatever it might be, what do you think? You could just give us like one big lesson for the world to learn. What do you think we can learn from the extraordinary challenges and then solutions that you witnessed living in Cambodia during COVID?
One lesson would be that's a tough one. I think trust in the experts' opinions and sort of trust that if the experts say that this is the approach that you have to do right now, then do it. But also, if the experts are saying that it's not a threat right now, then live your life. And I think that a lot of countries that had longer lockdowns than we did, and I'm also a stand-up comedian in my spare time, amateur, and I do performances in different countries around the world, and I keep hearing from every country that the world has not yet gone back. We don't get the same number of people going to live performances that we did pre-COVID, and that really makes me sad because we've gone over this. We're all vaccinated. COVID's kind of over. Obviously, it's still a disease that we have, but people aren't dying to the same extent. And now the world is losing out on all this magic that it had before because of that. And even though the experts are telling us go out and go to watch events and go to do this and go to hang out with your friends, I think that in Cambodia we were lucky that our lockdown was only 3 weeks, and we only had 7 weeks in total of a time where I couldn't go to the bar to see my friends. And because of that, I think that we did go back to exactly how things were before. Unfortunately, the world in many countries has not.
Right. Well, thank you so much, David. Those are some great lessons, and it's been a great episode. I've really enjoyed learning from you and really just having my eyes opened to the global phenomenon of COVID, but specifically Cambodia and how it responded to that threat. So thanks for coming on the podcast. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. As always, remember to lift where you stand.